Hello, and welcome to the Sci-Fi Christian Book Reviews, brought to you by the Sci-Fi-Christian.com. I am Ben DeBono, here to talk to you today about the novel Flight of the Angels by Aaron and Allan Reini. Now, I need to start this review with a couple of disclaimers, okay? Because I have the pleasure of knowing these two authors, father and son team, through the podcast that we do that Matt and I do at the Sci-Fi Christian. They've been fans of us for, I don't know, I guess about the last year or so, maybe longer, I'm not sure, sometime in there. And through that time, we've corresponded. First, it was just kind of emails about the podcast, but I've gotten to know them a little bit personally as well. I have never actually met them in person, but, you know, we're Facebook friends, we've exchanged emails and whatnot, and I genuinely like these guys a lot. So I feel it's important, in order to maintain my integrity as a reviewer, to let you guys know that that's the case here. Now, I'm going to make every attempt to be fair in spite of that, but I feel compelled to put it out there. Now, on the flip side of that, you know, if my relationship with these two guys makes me more inclined to like the book, there's a few things that might make me more inclined to dislike it, to maybe balance that out by way of disclaimer. That it is A, self-published novel, it is B, Christian fiction, and it is C, a first novel, all of which are things I generally try and avoid. Self-published novels, you know, just because they're such a crapshoot, and it's not to say that you can't self-publish a great novel. You can, of course you can. But, I mean, let's just think about what self-publishing is for a second. It's wonderful because anyone can publish anything. And it's terrible because anyone can publish anything. And I've read enough self-published novels to make me really wary of that. I'm not saying it's not a good option. Obviously, it's really tough to get your foot in the door at a publishing house. So I very much understand why people do it. If I ever wrote a novel, I'd probably do the same thing. But from a reader's perspective, if I'm going to sit down and read something, I tend to want to go with something that, you know, I can look at reviews on Amazon that aren't written just by friends and families, which is kind of what tends to happen with self-published novels, and maybe get a more objective idea of what I'm actually going to be reading, and then something that's had really the rigorous professional editing of a publishing house. So I'm biased against self-published novels. And I'm biased against Christian fiction for reasons that are obvious to anyone who has ever read much Christian fiction, that it tends to be really lame. You know, it's a failed industry in a lot of ways. Not in terms of sales and success, but in terms of quality. You know, you can list your great Christian novels, obviously not thinking in terms of classics or whatever, but in terms of relatively recent fiction, you could list those in probably one hand. I mean, they're just not out there. Okay, and then I'm, you know, biased against first novels, because first novels tend to be pretty rough, you know, and this is true of great writers. There are amazing, amazing writers who, you look at that first novel and it's just not that great. I mean, you look at Stephen King's early stuff, which was republished as the Bachman books. Not very good. Even Carrie, his first really published, his first major novel that got picked up by a publishing house. Not that great. I mean, I know it's famous, but it's really one of the weaker books he's ever written. And so you have stuff like that, where a lot of times it takes a writer 2, 3, 4 novels to get to where they're going. I've talked about Neil Stephenson a lot, and I haven't read his very early stuff, but I've heard it's pretty rough. And even Snow Crash, which is like his 4th or 5th novel he ever wrote, it's good, but it's really, really flawed. And it's not until he gets to the Diamond Age of Cryptonomicon that he becomes one of the great contemporary writers. So I'm not going to pretend like those 3 things are on the same level as my friendship with these guys. I wanted to like this book a lot, okay? But, you know, just by way of saying that there were some things that maybe balance out in terms of me being able to go into this a little more objectively. So disclaimers aside, let's get into the book, Flight of the Angels. First, what's it about? And I'll spend a little more time on the plot than usual, just because a lot of times I don't like reviews that go into a lot of summaries, because you can go out and do your own stupid research and read what it's about. But since this isn't a very well-known book, maybe you won't spend the time to go look at it. It's less accessible in terms of places that have talked about it than some of the other stuff I review. So I'll spend a little more time talking about the plot. So we really have two main storylines that are going on. The world that this novel exists in is a world where Christianity is illegal. So there's some parallels that are set up to kind of the early church history and the Roman persecution. The colony that our Christian characters are existing in is called Pella, which I haven't checked this, but in the book they say that this is the same name as one of the colonies used by the early Christians, which is very interesting to me. And I've been meaning to research that some more, just haven't gotten around to it. But so we have some parallels like that. So our first storyline is that we have this fighter squadron, who their squadron name is the Angels, and they are in charge of protecting this colony of outlawed Christians that are in hiding from the government and from other various people who want to kill them. And then our second plot line is more made up of characters who are kind of still a part of the normal society who aren't Christians. And in particular, one guy named Derek Mason, who is involved with this company called Gen Corporation, and he is tasked with hunting down why these certain machines are failing in the corporation. They're like these mining machines or whatever, and he's a programmer, and he's supposed to track down why they're failing in spite of his code he thinks is in good shape. And so this leads him to start to untangle what amounts to something of a conspiracy within the company for, as you can imagine, nefarious ends. Okay, so here's how I think I'll do this. I'm going to tell you some things I really, really liked in the novel. I'll tell you some things that I'm a little mixed on, and then I'll get into some criticisms that I have of the novel, hopefully in a constructive way for you, Aaron and Allan. So things I really liked about this novel, things it did really well. And first let me say here that my overall impression of this novel is very strong. This is a good novel. It's not a perfect novel. There are times when the fact that it's a first novel shows. There are times when the fact that it was self-published and didn't have the benefits of the editing process. I don't know what Aaron and Allan did for editing. And it's not poorly edited, so don't hear me say that. But it didn't have the benefit of the major publishing house's editing resources. And at times that shows. But overall, this doesn't feel like a first novel. And overall, it doesn't feel like a self-published work. You know, it feels a lot more smooth than that. It feels a lot better written than that. So there are isolated moments where those tendencies or things you would expect from those categories kind of rear their ugly heads. But as a whole, this novel is very, very well written. It's well paced. And these guys have a lot of talent. They really do. Very, very talented writers, and it shows. And I'm excited to see how they develop that and learn from what they experienced with this novel, learn from some of the feedback they get and whatnot for the future books in the series. Okay, so things I really liked about this novel. Number one, I like the structure a lot. I'm kind of a structure guy when it comes to novels. If a novel is really well structured, that intrigues me a lot. In fact, again, if I ever write a novel, I'm going to really put a lot of thought into how I want to structure it and almost make that the basis for the story, because I'm just fascinated by the way that structure ties into themes and ties into narrative and all of this. And it's not just something you have to put in there that's for the sake of making the book work. I honestly believe structure impacts what a book is trying to say. And these guys do a really good job at the structure of this novel. In particular, you have these two independent storylines I was describing. And I was reading along with these, and all of a sudden it clicked for me. I was like, a third of the way through the book or whatever, that these two storylines haven't crossed over yet. And that's a good thing. They do eventually, as of course they should. But it seems to me that one of the errors that a novelist could fall into, especially somebody who this is their first work, would be to say, oh, we got to get these guys, we got to cross these plots as soon as possible so that our audience doesn't feel lost, and they feel like they don't feel like we're just telling these two independent stories or whatever. And they don't do that, and that's a good thing, because doing that is a structural error. And it would show your audience that you're nervous about your plot or whatever, you're uneasy with having these two largely independent storylines, or, all of that. And so I really applaud that. That was very well done. I was very pleased with this realization went off in my head, and I was almost disappointed when they do eventually cross, even though, in terms of the novel, it makes sense, and it had to happen, which of course it should. You ultimately do want to bring your storylines together, but avoiding the temptation to do that too early and maintain this complex structure that they had was a good thing. The novel mixes in good flashbacks to fill out backstory. There are some action scenes, which, if you know me, my eyes kind of glaze over at action scenes, and so those aren't my favorite part of the book, but they're well written and they're well paced and they don't dominate the novel or whatever, so I was really pleased with that as well. Like the characters, especially the central characters, I'll talk about some of the periphery characters are a little more mixed on. But especially the character of Derek Mason, I felt like the way that they developed him and his motivations were really good. He's the non-Christian character, and I was just dreading that we were going to hit the Christian novel cliche where our non-Christian character hits his knees in the final few pages and all of a sudden gives his life to Jesus and then everything's good. I mean, so many Christian novels just go there, and it's so lame. Not the conversion's lame, don't misunderstand me, it's just the cliche in the novel. And they don't do that here. I suppose spoiler alert or whatever, but that's not that big of a spoiler, you'll get over it. And I'm really glad, especially given that there's two, I don't know how many more novels there's going to be in this series, but there's for sure a sequel that they're writing. And so giving themselves the chance to not force his character into the point of becoming a Christian in a unnatural way just because we're at the end of the book, it's time for a conversion. I assume that he'll probably get there eventually. That seems to be the direction his character arc is on, but it feels natural letting that develop, where for them to fall into that cliche would have been a very, very big mistake with his character. I like the details in the novel. Details are one of those things, especially in the related to the fighter squadron and the way these ships work, and this is really well thought through how all this works, and a lot of the details with that aspect. And I'll be honest, I skim details a lot, but I like that they're there. It's one of those things where when you hit we're now going to talk about the specifications of this missile and how it ties into this fighter plane or whatever. I don't read that stuff word for word, and I didn't read it word for word here, but I like that it's there because it lets me know as a reader, even though I'm not digesting every last syllable of this, that the writers have thought through what they're doing, and it gives us as a reader, me as a reader and other people as a reader, a almost subconscious confidence in the fact that these guys know what they're doing. They aren't in over their heads with this story. So I was very, very pleased with that. I felt like the novel reached a satisfying conclusion, even with letting enough threads be left dangling to set up the sequel. But they tied things up enough where this book feels complete. It doesn't feel like, you just read half a novel and they arbitrarily stopped for the sake of getting it published so they could write the sequel. It feels like this story came to a completion, but then of course there's a larger story around it that is now going to continue into the next book or books, depending on what they ultimately do with the series. So lots of really good things in this novel. Just very pleased with how they pulled this off, and they should be proud of themselves with the good job they did. Now, things I'm a little mixed on, or things that let's wait till the sequel to see maybe some of these will fall into the good category or into the bad category, depending on how things shake out in the sequel. Some of the periphery characters are a little flat, which is okay. They actually do improve this throughout the novel. And I should mention that this novel gets better as you go on, which is another thing that kind of bucks the first novel trends. A lot of first novels kind of run out of steam and it's like, oh, now we got to wrap this up and we're not quite sure what we're doing because we haven't done this before. And it's like, okay, I see the talent there, but this really ran out of gas. And this doesn't do that. The second half of this novel is stronger than the first half, and that's impressive to me. Not that the first half is bad or anything, but they didn't run out. Not only did they not run out of gas, but they seemed to build on everything they'd done before until you reach the end of the novel, and that's really, really good. I like it when a book does that. And that's the case with some of these periphery characters. There's a character named Scott, who is kind of our obligatory cocky fighter jock, which, I'll be honest, makes me roll my eyes a little bit because we've seen that character so many times. But they really start to flesh him out in the second half of the novel. They have some chapters that are written from his perspective, and he seems to slowly but surely be moving away from that cliche, and he's not quite there yet at the end of this novel, but he's on his way, and that's a good thing. So I'm excited. I really hope that his character development keeps going in the sequel. Right now, he kind of reminds me of Starbuck from BSG, the new BSG, where in the pilot she's just an intolerable character. She's a walking cliche and everybody hated her. And by the end of the series, she's one of the best characters in the show. And Scott right now is somewhere in the middle of that transition. He started out as an intolerable character in a lot of ways. And I don't mean that in a mean way, but I didn't like him. And now he's getting some depth. He's getting some development, and we're definitely making progress. Is he the best character in this book? Nope. But is he on his way to being a good character? Yes. So hopefully we'll get the rest of that progression in the sequel. But definitely encouraging signs thus far. Not every character, though, makes that same jump. There's a character named Elliot who's a friend of Derek Mason, who I just couldn't stand. Sorry guys, I didn't like him at all. He was a very flat character. There's not a lot of depth to what he's doing, and he comes across as really obnoxious, which is kind of the point. But the fact that we know so little about him, he just kind of came across as a walking cliche. So that's kind of the other end of the spectrum. He started out kind of like Scott, but never got there. And he's a much less important character than Scott, so it's not like he's in every chapter or whatever, but when he does appear on screen, it's kind of, I cringed a little bit because he just was not working for me at all. So we have some stuff like that. Another thing that's a bit mixed that I liked but wanted them to go further on is, I mentioned that there's some parallels with early Christian persecution and the world that the Reinis have created here in Flight of the Angels. And one of the things I was hoping they would do at the start of the novel, and they did, was touch on the issue of violence in terms of the Christian response. We learn fairly early on that the Angels have standing rules of engagement that don't allow them to fire on manned aircraft. Okay, so anything that has human life aboard, they're not allowed to shoot. And so there is an ethic of life that exists in this colony. and in this fighter squadron. And that's interesting to me because it comes into tension with, well, is this really a good thing? Are we putting ourselves and the colony in danger because of that? And it's kind of brought to the forefront at a few points. I wanted it to go farther, though. 'Cause what's there is really good, but I felt like it needed to go farther. And there's still opportunity for this to happen in the sequel. Here's what I mean, in a couple of ways. Number one, a lot of the aircraft they're fighting at the end of the novel are unmanned aircraft. And it's a little bit of a cop-out on this. Let me say right from the get-go, it's necessary for the sake of the plot. It works in terms of the plot. But thematically, it feels like a cop-out. So organic, natural, well-written from a plot perspective, from a thematic perspective, it kind of feels like we're hitting on this violence issue and what should the rules of engagement be, and it's coming into tension. Then we get our big finale and we're mostly fighting unmanned aircraft, and it's kind of a thematic letdown there. Now, there's room to continue to explore this theme in the sequel, and I hope that they do. I hope that our squadron is put in a position where they are coming up against manned aircraft with human life aboard, and they have to make that hard choice. Do you stand by your ideals, or do you put yourselves and your colony at risk? And where it really is that lose-lose scenario. Put your characters in that position. That would be a really fulfilling thing to do with this theme. The other area where I wanted them to go a little farther with this is that the whole issue of nonviolence is pretty major in early Christianity. And so how does that ethic of acceptable violence, if you will, that exists in a lot of contemporary Christianity? Obviously, there is strains of Christian pacifism even today, but in a sense, just war is accepted today by most Christians, or certainly a sizable number. Self-defense, things like that. And I think that that's in tension with some of what we find in the early Christian literature. And then early Christianity comes into tension with itself as soldiers begin to convert. And what do we do with that in our ethic of nonviolence or whatever? And so early Christianity is made up with this fascinating example of this theme that Aaron and Allan are exploring in a very real way. And I wanted them to push that parallel a little farther in terms of their colony and early Christianity when it comes to the violence issue. And then, what do we do about just war? If the colony winds up being threatened, as it looks like it's going to in the sequel, and you are in a full-on shooting war with the enemy, how do we debate just war? What does this look like? What does being in this persecuted state and the parallels that they have to early Christianity, how does that change their mindset about violence? And those are the questions I wanted the guys to ask. And we get that, but only in the form of rules of engagement for these fighters. I wanted that really philosophical, theological debate, not just in terms of rules of engagement, but in terms of what's the mindset of Christian theology as a whole now that it's been put in this new persecuted position. And how does that change it on this issue? So, maybe that's something that Aaron and Allan are saying, we are not interested in, writing Dostoevsky here. We're trying to write a fun novel or whatever. So maybe they're not interested in doing that. That's something I would do. And I would have been interested in seeing them explore it. And I mention it because I feel like their novel is well disposed to push that kind of comparison and have that kind of discussion. And I'd like to see them do it. We'll see if I wind up getting my wish. And then one final kind of mixed thing. The supernatural elements in the novel, we get some hints of these. And it's really unclear where these are at the end of the novel. Where is there something supernatural going on, especially with some of our villains, and how exactly does this tie into the world, and what are the exact rules of this world in terms of more fantasy elements, or theological demonic elements, if that may be the case. I mean, is the demonic an overt presence here, or these, some kind of other supernatural thing? So that seems to be something that's going to get explored more in the sequel. There's some heavy hints of that, but I felt like maybe in this first book it would have been nice to have that the rules of this world made just a little bit more clear so that we know where we stand. Okay, but certainly not a major issue. Okay, now for, maybe one or two criticisms. And really just two I'm going to point out. Number one, there's a few places where the novel takes narratival shortcuts. In particular, there's an early scene where Derek, who has been tasked with investigating why these mining machines are failing, he goes to the mine that is using them, and he's kind of asking questions like, hey, what's going on with these machines that you guys have been getting and all that. And he's getting stonewalled and everything. And then seemingly out of the blue, just as it looks like he's going to get nowhere, a character who just kind of shows up and tells him, oh, they never showed up. We never got those. And that character, we see him at one other point in the novel much later, but it is relatively minor character. And to me, I was kind of left scratching my head saying, well, what's this guy's motivation for talking here? And it seems like we had kind of taken a shortcut because Derek needed to find out this piece of information to propel the plot. And that's fine. But it wasn't satisfying to just have somebody kind of out of the blue tell him what he needed to know. I wanted him to work for it a little bit more. And so this felt like a narrative shortcut. And there's a few points where that sort of thing crops up. Is it major? Nope. I mean, it's kind of like the novel hits that moment. It's a little unsatisfying, and then we move on and we're back to really good stuff again. So it's not, it's not hugely problematic, but I did notice that at a number of points. And then number two, and this is probably my biggest complaint, and maybe my one really significant complaint about the novel. Where are the other Christians? The colony that we see is very, very evangelical in nature, which is fine. And I want to preface this by saying that Aaron and Allan are wonderful people in terms of being accepting of those who aren't, evangelical. I think they're evangelical. I'm not quite even entirely sure what tradition they're a part of. But for example, my Catholicism, they've been wonderful about it. We've had some great conversations. And they've been very kind and loving and models of ecumenism. So don't hear me saying that this criticism here is in any way a reflection on them as individuals, but in the context of the novel, I was left kind of scratching my head saying, why are the only Christians that we actually meet evangelicals? Well, where are the other Protestants? Where are the Orthodox? Where are the Catholics? Obviously that's the one I would gravitate towards. And that's a little problematic because one of the questions that I find myself asking, given the setup of this novel, is how does this sort of thing, how does being outlawed change Christianity? And I guess I just don't buy that even if you want to say, okay, this is a specifically evangelical colony, and I can buy that, okay? There are mentions at the end of the novel of there being other colonies, so I guess theoretically we might have our good Catholic colony or whatever where I am, or my descendants, since this is well in the future, we're hanging out in the Catholic colony, whatever. I wish that would have been more explicit, but just for the sake of argument, I can buy that this is an evangelical colony. But even within that, it looks and feels very much like contemporary evangelicalism. I mean, there's Bible studies and, we have conversations with the pastor, and it just feels very much like contemporary evangelical culture and contemporary evangelical theology. And that's really not satisfying to me, because I want to see if Christianity gets outlawed, how does that change Christianity? How does that change evangelicalism? How does that, if we just, again, focus just on the evangelical question, how does that change not only evangelical theology, but evangelical practice? What do things what values and convictions that we hold right now do we let go? in spite of this changed world? How does this fundamentally alter the way that we think about faith and theology and practice? And we just don't get that sort of exploration, even a little bit in this novel. And that to me was really disappointing. And that is my biggest knock against the novel. Again, something that maybe we can explore more in the sequel. It's by no means a damning criticism, but that was something when I realized, they were kind of setting up some of these parallels, like with the name of the colony and everything. I was excited. It's like, okay, how does this fundamentally change Christianity? We never got there thematically. Not even close, really. So, two parts of that criticism. Again, where are the other Christians? And how does it change them? But even if we're just going to focus on an evangelical colony, why does it look so similar to modern evangelicalism? I want to really push on that thematically, because if you're going to make this a believable world, I think you have to explore that a little more. Now, the world is believable, but it's believable because we don't spend that much time in the colony. And every time we kind of touch on some of those elements, it took me out of the novel. Now, I might be the only one who notices something like that, because I'm a theology nerd. I'm a now former evangelical who is a recent Catholic convert, so these issues are in my head big time. So I get that maybe this is just me. But even if it is just me, I do think it's an issue in the novel. I really do. And really my one significant problem that I would have with this book. Again, none of that, I can guarantee you, none of that is reflective on Aaron and Allan as people. Absolutely not. They are just models of Christian charity when it comes to being willing to enter into that dialogue with someone like myself in a different tradition, and being loving and accepting of those differences and learning from each other and all that. The models of ecumenism. But unfortunately, that doesn't quite show up in the novel. And that's a little bit of a bummer to me. So that's kind of my one big criticism. But overall, this is a really, really good novel. Please read it. Not just because they're my friends, not just because they're fans of the Sci-Fi Christian, but because it's good. If you're somebody like me who's wary of self-published stuff, this is the one to support. Don't just go out and haphazardly start downloading people's novels that they put out there, because honestly most of them aren't worth your time, but this one is. So take it from someone who doesn't like self-published novels, doesn't like Christian fiction, doesn't like first novels, despite the fact that it's in that damning little trifecta. This novel bucks those trends big time. It's well worth reading. It's really well done, and I honestly can't wait to see how Aaron and Allan develop. If this is what they do as the first novel, I can't wait to see what happens when they really, kick it into an upper gear in their second, third, fourth novel and beyond. These guys are really talented, and I'm excited to watch where they go from here. So, final rating, 4 stars out of 5. Tempted to go to 4.5, but I know that's my friendship towards these guys talking. So for the sake of being an objective reviewer, we're going to leave it at 4 out of 5. Really enjoy it. Highly recommend it. Check it out. And to Aaron and Allan, thank you both for an excellent and thought-provoking read. So that's all for now. I'm Ben Bono, and this is the Sci-Fi Christian Book Reviews. Goodbye.